Awesome. So I was trying to catch up with Dad, who preached to you the last 2 weeks, on what he's done in Joshua. And what I understand is we covered Jericho 2 weeks ago, and then last week we covered Achan's sin, the whole hoarding the gold thing, right? And a nice coat, which seemed a little odd, right? Silver, gold, and a coat. All right. So we will, what we're going to do today is, there's a part at the end there, so there's the story, right, of what we're looking at is the people of Israel taking the promised land. And the last time I was here, we talked about them crossing the river Jordan to enter into the promised land. And they're beginning to go city by city to take the land that God promised to them, to drive out the people who were living there. And right after they then win at a town called Ai, spelled A-I, there's this interlude here in verses 30 to 35 of chapter 8, where they go through some worship practices. And I'm going to read that real quick. And I'm going to read it in the Message, just because it reads easy. Then Joshua built an altar to the God of Israel on Mount Ebal. He built it following the instructions of Moses, the servant of God, to the people of Israel, and written in the book of the Revelation of Moses. An altar of whole stones that hadn't been chiseled or shaped by an iron tool. On it they offered to God whole burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings. He also wrote out a copy of the Revelation of Moses on the stones. He wrote it with the people of Israel looking on. All Israel was there, foreigners and citizens alike, with their elders, officers, and judges, standing on opposite sides of the chest, facing the Levitical priests who carry God's covenant chest. Half of the people stood with their backs to Mount Gerizim, and half with their backs to Mount Ebal, to bless the people of Israel, just as Moses, the servant of God, had instructed earlier. After that, he read out everything written in the Revelation, the blessing and the curse, everything in the book of the Revelation. There wasn't a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua didn't read to the entire congregation, men, women, children, and foreigners who had been with them on the journey. So, I actually read 7, 8, and 9 this week to try to just, because I haven't been here in 2 weeks, to get back into where we are. And this part stuck out to me as sort of representative of the section. Because beginning with Jericho, and then that whole episode with Ai, who held on to the spoils of war and got killed for it, and then ending with this, where in the middle of a war campaign, they stop, set up an altar, put people in a particular formation, and write down some things and have some kind of worship practice. These events all seem kind of odd to me. I don't know if they seem odd to you, but they seem odd to me. The stories we've been reading seem a little far away, and not just geographically, but really removed from how we live today. And so there's this thing of, okay, we're going to go fight the nation of Jericho. We're going to take this city with the strongest walls we've ever seen and some of the biggest dudes. And God says, all right, here's what I want you to do. Blow some trumpets, march around the city, wait, do it again. Do it again. 7 times. That's the plan. Right? And then how about the thing with Achan, the guy, so he says, okay, you're going to take Jericho, you're going to win, but destroy everything. Take nothing for yourselves. And the guy holds on to some gold and a coat, a Michael Kors maybe, and he gets killed for it. He dies. I can understand where he's at, right? I mean, it seems like a waste to just destroy everything. And they kill him for holding on to it. It seems odd. It seems way different from how we are. It seems some kind of far away. It seems like how they treated Achan there was a little harsh. And then we come to this story in verses 30 to 35. And so here they are plowing through some cities. God is with them. They get the whole sin thing figured out, right? Get that taken care of by killing a guy. And then they just stop, build an altar of uncut stones. It probably takes a little while. Get everybody lined up, all these thousands of people. Read some scripture, right? Make some offerings. I mean, it seems like you just try to capture the momentum. I mean, keep rolling on. These people know you're coming. if they see you out there just hanging out, you might be a little bit vulnerable. It seems odd. It seems odd to stop in the middle of a war campaign to have a worship service. It seems odd. And I think it's too easy and misleading to just say, well, that was a long time ago, they're different. You know, it's just kind of neat. You just read it. You don't really have to understand it. I think it's too easy to do that. It's also misleading. But here's the thing. As I read through these passages, and you read about how they defeated Jericho, how they handled Achan's sin, and the stuff they were doing with reading old texts and setting up an altar and making offerings, it's almost as if what's happening in the earthly has a spiritual significance. And what we do in the spirit has an effect in the earthly. It's almost as if those two things are connected. Right? And in fact, I think that's why it seems odd. But it's almost as if those two things are connected. Like how they're worshiping is important in the middle of a war campaign because it has an effect on the war. And how they handle Achan, the guy who disobeyed God, how they handle him is important because it affects how they relate to God. So what they do in the natural with this guy who disobeyed has a spiritual significance. The spiritual practice of building the altar and reading the words of Moses and making offerings, that spiritual act has an effect on how the rest of the war is going to go and how they're going to live in that land for the next several generations. The things they do in the spirit have an effect in the natural, and the things they do in the natural have an effect in the spirit. This is why I think we don't understand it. Because for a long time, our world has said, well, you know, I just go to church, and then on Monday I go to work. Two different things. Or, yeah, I mean, sometimes my wife and I fight, but we give to the church really well, so it's cool. Right? Or they say, yeah, I'm going to church because life is awful, but one day I'll just get out of here. Right? And we take the spiritual and the physical and make them different things. Life and heaven, different things. Religion and relationship, different things. That is misleading. And it's not what we see in the story of God's people here in Joshua. Okay? What we see is a people whose spirituality and livelihood are tied together, intertwined. You can't separate them. Spirituality and life are tied together. And I think we get this, actually. I think there are some other places in our lives outside of God that we get this. We were with my uncle, and we were talking about Aaron's family grew up on a farm. My uncle grew up on a farm, too, in like northwest Kansas, apparently. This is the first time I had heard this story. And we were talking about what it's like to move on from land as a family. Aaron grew up on 100 acres, and the farm just sold. So, like, her family's going through this process. It's been in the family for 4 generations. So they're going through this process of grieving that. And we were talking to my uncle about this, and he said, yeah, you know, it's funny about land. He said, my parents, so my cousin's grandparents, so these folks are elderly, live out in the middle of nowhere on a farm. It's like, eventually we're going to have to get them out of there. You know, it's really hard to get out there. It's really hard to get them the services they need. And he said, but it's funny, you know, our brother thinks we should keep it. And he said, it doesn't make any sense to keep it. And he said, well, he said, my brother figures, oh, we can run a bed and breakfast. And my uncle's name is Lyle. His brother's name is Mitch. And Lyle said to Mitch, Mitch, are you going to live there? No, just like, it'll be nice. Like, we can have it. And he's like, well, you realize it's really far away. Who's going to want to stay in a bed and breakfast out in the middle of nowhere in northwest Kansas? You know? Well, you know, it's a nice place. Of course people want to go there. It's like a retreat. You know? But what he's doing there is he's taking how he feels about the land and giving it like emotional and spiritual significance. So the reason he doesn't want to let go is because he has some kind of tie to the land. And he doesn't realize that it doesn't make sense in his life to hold on to it. Because who he is, who he believes himself to be, the kind of life he envisions for himself is tied to this land. And so they're connected. And it's really hard for him to separate them. Right? How about who remembers their first car?
Sure.
What was your first car?
Camaro.
Camaro? Well, that's too fancy.
1970 Volkswagen Van.
Oh, there you
1970. You guys had cooler first cars than
I have
that. A Volvo?
go.
1972 Duster.
Okay, all right. My first car was a 1987 Acura Integra that my godparents sold me for $500. This is, if you've met them, you know this fits them. For my 16th birthday, they didn't give me a car. They gave me the first right of refusal to buy their car. So, yeah. So, that's funny. And it had pop-up lights. But, you know, we think back on those cars and it's just like, oh, that was a great car.
No.
Right? No? What's your first car?
I was a 96 Oldsmobile Silhouette.
Yeah,
Okay, all right, that's another good
Oh, the hot car. Yeah, the AC didn't work and the windows didn't open.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't miss it.
Yeah.
I sold it with no tears. I was like,
Bye.
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 But for most of us who didn't have an Oldsmobile Silhouette, we think back on our first car like, man, that was a great car, right? But now we drive an 08 Mazda and a really nice car that Aaron's parents gave us. I would not trade either of those for an 87 Integra, right? But there's something about it being your first car, the memories you had in it, like the feeling of empowerment, like I can go anywhere. All of that begins to make that car mean more to you than maybe in the practical it should. And I think that's evidence that as people, there's this spiritual, emotional side of us, and there's this like practical, physical, earthly side of us, and they're tied together. You can't separate them. Now, you have to, that's why selling a farm is hard, right? You have to find a way to figure out what it is you're actually excited about. That's why wrecking your car can be devastating, right? Aside from the fact that you have to get a new one then. So I think we get this. I think we get this thing about spiritual, emotional, and physical, earthly being tied together. But for some reason when we read this, it's tough to get. But here's the thing. Living as God's people means integrating the body and spirit with the body and the spirit. It means integrating our spirituality and our vocation. Right? Vocation, like what we do, how we live. It means bringing those together. So in the garden, when God formed Adam, then he breathed breath into his nostrils, two things actually came together. The breath of life and the body that came from dust. And living as God's people means living whole in that way. And that's why these events in Joshua play out the way they do. So, we could probably get a physics professor in here and try to figure out if the sound waves from the music they were playing at Jericho shook the walls enough, or, who knows? But the point is, God told them to do something, they did it, and God kept his word. That's the point of Jericho. And I'm terribly oversimplifying it, I'm sure. But the reality that took place when they took Jericho was a representation of their faith before God. So there's the spiritual piece, believing God for what he's going to do, that manifests in the natural. They overtook one of the strongest cities they'd ever seen. Right? Achan sinned. So it seems like, wow, couldn't we just make him clean or do some sort of punishment thing? Like give the gold back or whatever. But the idea is that the problem with Achan disobeying God is that he wasn't putting God first. And here in this moment, when they're receiving the promise of God to be God's people in this best land in the whole world, there's this one guy who's not living the way that God asked him to live. And so in that moment they said, all right, we got to take this seriously. If we really want to take this land, he cannot be a part of us. Gone. And everybody connected to him, gone. Dead. So the reason that earthly thing had to happen, they had to take out his whole family, is to make a spiritual reality true, that in that moment they were the pure people of God. So that earthly practice had a spiritual significance. At Jericho, the spiritual practice of obedience of God had an earthly manifestation that they overtook that city. And that's the thing about this worship ritual thing we see here in 8:30 to 35. I did a little reading. The two kinds of offerings they talk about there. Like, I think sometimes we read about them sacrificing animals and we think it's all about this sacrificial system that actually comes later in the Bible. So no sacrificial system yet. So it's not like they were necessarily going through things that they did every day in a temple. But the first offering they did was an offering of atonement. So we can say they're atoning for the Achan thing. But the next one, the peace offering, the way the peace offering worked is they'd burn all the fat up to God from the animal, and the rest of it made a feast for them. So the way that Moses had told them to go into the land was put on this worship celebration, read the Word of God, remember who God is. As you enter, make a sacrifice to atone for all sin, and then have a peace offering so everybody can celebrate together with a feast. And so as I realized that, then I read there, and it says, starting at verse 33, all Israel was there, foreigners and citizens alike, with their elders, officers, and judges, standing on opposite sides of the chest, facing the Levitical priests who carry God's covenant chest. So as you start to think about it as a celebration, as they name all of those people, it's like, dang, that was a big party. Right? When I first read it, and they're lining everybody up and put the priest here and put the meat on the thing and burn it up and build a special kind of altar, I'm like, God, what kind of drudgery is this? But then you understand it's a celebration. We've entered the land. We are God's people. Let's remember His word. Let's offer a peace offering and have a feast. And you realize that this intricate spiritual practice represents some real earthly stuff. That they had been slaves in Egypt for generations. They had wandered in the desert for 40 years, living on bread and water from rocks. And they finally enter the land of milk and honey, and the first thing they do is read God's word and celebrate. That is powerful. When we realize it's not an interruption, it's not a distraction, it's not making themselves unnecessarily vulnerable. What it is in the midst of a physical, earthly victory, remembering the spiritual, powerful champion and celebrating with him. Saying, we are only here because God is so great. We are only going to take this land because God is going to give it to us. Let's remember that and let's celebrate. In the midst of our earthly lives, let's not forget the spiritual significance. And let's not let them to become two separate things, but let's continue to live as people, whole and integrated, sent by God and empowered by Him, enlivened by His Spirit, safe because He protects us. And here's what's crazy. Remember, we started and we said this stuff seems a little odd. And some people talk about like ecclesiology, the study of church. And they say, where else in the world do you walk into a room with a bunch of people you don't see very often and just sing some songs? Right? Well, I say, yeah, it's odd. But it's odd precisely because right here is the moment when the Spirit comes into the earth and does something. Where the life we live every day and the life God has us living collides into one thing. That's why it's so weird. That's why we do things like serve other people even when it's hard for us. We give of ourselves for the benefit of others because we believe that in that the spirit and the earthly come together. And that's the life we were meant to live. We worship the Father, sometimes in words we don't understand, because we believe that there's spiritual significance in earthly reality and they're connected. And unless we live life connected, we're not living life fully alive. So our worship, our life as Christians, is odd precisely because we are the intersection of spiritual realities and earthly manifestations. And we have to live life integrated. Because here's the thing, God is interrupting our life to bring us fullness on the way to the promise. There is no doubt there are better things coming. There is no doubt there are better things coming. But here in this moment, God invades our reality to give us a taste of what's coming, that things might be a little bit crazy because the spiritual and the earthly are colliding in the moment. Man, that's awesome. Right? Come on.